Saw 10, great movie, tied for my second favorite in the franchise with the first sequel, funny
Yep.
enough. You have been on this franchise since it launched. You are one of the few outside of Tobin, Mark, and Oren to still be with this franchise to this day. And it's crazy.
And Kevin, our director.
And Kevin, yes. And it's crazy to think that we are now up to 10 and 20 years later. How does it feel for you, having been a part of this since it launched, to now be where we are?
It's pretty wild, although it to some in some corner of my mind, it feels sort of like being in a band that just won't die, and like going out on tour again. So it's I'm constantly amazed that the fan base is so like dedicated and up for it, and they're stuck with the franchise and get into excruciating detail about analyzing the characters and the linkages and the interrelationships between their little teasers and bits and pieces in the various sequels. And of course, when we made the first one, we didn't know it was going to turn into, a global juggernaut of movie franchise. And I tell this story all the time, but I still have a fond memory of James Wan as we were finishing up the sound mix and post-production on the first one, sort of saying, well, if this thing winds up going straight to video, I promise I'll rent a movie theater so we can all see our names on the big screen at least once. And because, when you've done good work and you've done your best and you think it's the greatest thing ever, but you never know if something is going to find an audience, whether it's a record or a movie. There's a million ways it can all go sideways before it really resonates with the viewers. So it's extremely gratifying and reassuring that what we thought was good has found its audience, and I guess they think it's good too. So that's awesome.
It is awesome, especially when it gets to come to the point of Saw 10, where you guys have landed a certified fresh rating for, I hate to say for the first time in the franchise, but it is. And I'm curious, obviously the movie's qualities are down to the creatives more than necessarily you, but how does it feel for you still, though, to see that this is the best received one so far?
I'm, again, reassured by that. And I think it's in large part due to Tobin Bell's performance and just the sort of calm magnitude and dignity, I guess is a weird word to use when you're talking about a serial killer maniac, but just the way he presents the character and adds a little bit of depth and possibly encourages a little bit of sympathy on the part of the viewers to his plight. And, a big part of that, of course, is the producers, directors, and the writers who have been able to craft a storyline that allows that to come to the front. But every time I see Tobin on screen, I think, give him more screen time. This guy's fantastic. So he's very engrossing and engaging to watch, even when has such a restrained kind of delivery, which is part of the character. And, he's one of those character actors who I'd always spotted throughout my entire career. Like, do you remember the Tom Cruise legal drama, The Firm?
Yes.
When Tobin plays the sort of silent Norwegian assassin or whatever. Yes. And I remember seeing that movie, 20 years ago, and thinking, wow, who's that guy? Put him on screen more. And so a big part of it is just due to his sort of delivery and his just presence on screen. And I'm so glad that this movie really featured him much more than just being a disembodied voice over a loudspeaker or whatever.
I'm glad it did too. And you're right in that it got sympathy. He got sympathy from me, despite knowing everything that he had done in the years that followed this movie's story. But I'm curious, in him getting more screen time, if that made you have, how you approached scoring this movie, knowing that he was going to get more screen time. Did that give you new ideas of, more dramatic tones versus the kinetic thrills that the earlier movies had?
Absolutely. And, in in the large bulk of time in many of the previous movies, I'm kind of scoring it from the victim's viewpoint to some degree, that there's all these wild, menacing sounds coming at the audience in the same way that the trap or the bad situation is coming at the victims. And so for Saw X, the whole sort of first third of the movie is following Tobin on his little quest for this cure for his brain cancer. And there might be hope, and there might be an optimistic view of the future. And so it was great to be able to follow that. There've been little snippets of that in previous movies where there've been cues that are much more sort of emotional and gentle as they reveal bits and pieces of his backstory. But they're usually little islands within the stream of mayhem. So it was great to kind of follow a much longer arc over the whole, first act of this movie. And there were a lot of sort of musical techniques and motifs and sounds that I was using in that arc of the story that didn't really find a home in earlier installments in the franchise, because there just wasn't that much time to sort of build a longer curve within the score. And so, on this one, I used like mournful cello melodies and these disembodied, distant female vocal sounds and things that would have felt out of place, out of character anywhere else in the franchise. But it was fantastic that the story allowed to a little bit of an expansion of the sonic footprint within the score.
So one thing that kind of going off of that I love is that the past few movies retain a lot of the same feel for the original Saw movies as far as the music goes, while also still delivering something very fresh each time. And given your tenure in this franchise, I'm curious if you find that either creatively challenging or creatively exciting each time coming back and trying to find a new voice through your music for each sequel.
Well, there's always got to be sort of a massive component within the score that's brand new and never been heard before. And that usually happens in the trap scenes, where each of those is like some unique little sonic sculpture that I try to build with new stuff each time around. And because it's so heavy on the musical sound design component, it can get pretty labor intensive, but that whole exploration journey and searching for new sounds that I haven't heard before, and hopefully the audience hasn't heard before, that's kind of the whole reason I got into doing this or making records or any of that stuff, is finding sounds that I've never heard before and then going, oh, that's it. That's fantastic. At the same time, there are like a whole family of sounds which are sort of part of the Saw sonic fabric and those are sounds that I don't use in any other productions, or that I've kind of pushed aside into their own little drawer, because they're kind of part of the background murk within these movies. And so they're kind of, in my mind, are wholly owned subsidiaries of Saw Inc. And having those two aspects at hand while I'm working on the score is actually great, because there are certain little moments that can peek out, which are familiar sonic little islands. Like there's this sort of growling bowed metal thing that occurs whenever John Kramer's character kind of appears on screen, or whenever he has a menacing glare. And that's a sound from an instrument that I've used on these scores for the whole 20-year run. But at the same time, I can surround it with other newer sounds and try to create something that's not just a rinse and repeat of the previous stack. And I do, within my composing workstation, I sort of have a stack of tracks that these are the familiar Saw sounds that I can call upon as needed, to both to have callbacks for a particular character, but also sometimes callbacks for a place or a certain setting, like whenever there's a trap room, there's always sort of an intro while the victim is listening to their tape and it's becoming understood what's about to happen to them. And so that's an area that, even though the trap scene itself might have some wild sonic sculpture with scraping cello bows and all that sort of thing, that lead up into the actual clock starting to tick, is an area where I can make that transition from the familiar murky dungeon lair type of soundscape and gradually build it up to the moment when the tape stops and the timer starts.
I love that. It's such a great tension builder for leading up to the actual then tension kicking off. That's great to hear. Now, I read recently you were talking about how Nine Inch Nails were a big influence on this film's sound in particular. And I'm curious if you had any other big influences for how you wanted this film to sound in comparison to prior sequels.
I'm a huge fan of film scores that use unusual instruments or that just sound like they weren't done just with an orchestra sitting in a room. And although many of those scores and many of the movies that they accompany are not the kind of projects that they're very different to Saw movies, and they're not even the kind of things that I wind up getting involved in, much to my dismay. But I pay a lot of attention to super minimalist scores done by Johan Johansson and Hildur, who had done the Sicario movies, and also Johan, before he died, did a bunch of other of Denis Villeneuve's movies. And those are super, to me anyway, the score is super effective, but it's not like vertically dense. There's not a ton of tracks. There's not a million different sounds flying at you, which probably wouldn't work as intended in a Saw movie where you want stuff to be flying at the audience. But so I'm always referring to those scores just more from a sound design standpoint, that I'll hear sounds within those scores and think, ooh, that's so effective, even when it's only playing two notes or whatever. And other scores by composers like Mark Corvin, who did The Lighthouse, who actually had a hand in inventing this weird gadget behind me called the apprehension engine, which is sort of a combination of a hurdy-gurdy and a guitar that you can play with an e-bow, and you can use violin bows on these rulers and metal rods that stick out. And he's done a bunch of really cool scores, also very minimalist in terms of the density, but really creative in terms of the musical sound design and how effective it can be with just a few elements. So I really like the scores by Johan and Hildur and by Mark Corvin. And there's another team, two guys named Danny Bensi and Sonder Jurians, who did a lot of the Jason Bateman productions, like the series The Outsider. They also do Fear the Walking Dead, and they did a couple of great movies as well that Jason was involved in. They did Ozark, that's the series, which had a great, super minimalist but really effective score. And they did this kind of horror thriller, not sure what to call it, but this movie called The Gift, which was more scary than it had any right to be, because it's just a small cast and there's not like big violence, but there's a lot of tension, and the minimalist score and super effective musical sound design that they did. As soon as I saw those movies, I was like, wow, I got to look these guys up. Who is able to get away with such effective scoring with so few ingredients and such a non-heavy-handed approach. So those, even though Saw movies are by necessity kind of heavy-handed when it comes to the scoring, I'm always looking to those kind of examples where they can help provide some inspiration for a more light touch that's still effective.
Well, I love that range of inspirations you just mentioned. I mean, The Lighthouse remains my favorite Robert Eggers movie.
It's so good.
It's so good. And the score is especially incredible. Same with The Gift. I thought Joel Edgerton did a phenomenal job both behind and in front of the camera.
He's terrifying in The Gift. And I don't know what they did, but I think I don't know if he's wearing contacts that make his eyes look all black, or they removed his eyelashes. There's something weird going on with his eyes and the makeup design and the character design that makes it just extra creepy. And that was one of the first Joel Edgerton movies I had seen. I had seen him in that movie Loving, about the interracial marriage laws, which is a heartbreaking movie. And he was so like restrained and had a kind of small presence on screen for such a strong character. And then when I saw him in The Gift, I was like, this guy is fantastic. I'm watching everything he's in.
Well, hopefully you get to team up with him in the future.
That'd be fantastic. He's so strong on screen. I love his performances.
And he's clearly great in the director's chair too. So hopefully he brings you on one of his projects if he gets back to thrillers. Coming back to Saw though, when you first read the script for this film, I'm curious if there was any one scene that you were particularly excited to get to, write the music for.
Obviously the trap scenes are always a little sort of anxiety generators, because I know it's going to be an ever yet higher mountain to climb, because the last one we cranked it up to 11, so this time we need to go to 12. But in just judging from the script, I was actually most excited about the sort of the second half of the first third, where he's had the surgery and it's a success, but then he discovers the horrible truth behind it. And so that kind of corner, having the maximum amount of hope and joy and sort of warm sunrise as he's recovering from the surgery, and he's told it's been a success. And he kind of, there's that one scene where he's sitting in the park and he's drawing pictures of the reverse bear trap and other evil devices. And then he tears the page and crumples it up. And soon after that, he discovers the horrible truth. And so the score had to not have a jarring transition, but had to follow like a pretty wide range of situations for him. And that was kind of where I was most anxious to get into it, maybe because I thought it would be fun, but also maybe because I wanted to get to right to work at it, so I could, if it was going to take 10 attempts to get it right, then I wouldn't leave it to the last minute. But that whole segment of going from maximum warmth to maximum despair through the eyes of his character, that was kind of the sequence that I anticipated the most.
Well, it's kind of like you were saying earlier, it's this great arc of music in which it does, that transition is very smooth in going from his hopefulness to, oh shit, something's wrong.
Oh yeah, very wrong.
Now, as every Saw movie does, come time to reveal, you have that iconic track that also plays in a lot of these trailers. But something about this one in particular felt a little different. It sounded a little different to me. So, I mean, I see you nodding now. Did you do something differently with that theme for this one? It's
always a little bit of between a rock and a hard place when dealing with that ending theme that's always based on the cue called Hello Zepp from the first movie. Because in the first movie on the tape, John Kramer says, the character's name, who's been one of the protagonists and / victims throughout the whole movie, or as they call you in the hospital, Zepp. And so I know that whenever that theme appears, it's going to be important that it be instantly recognizable. And to the point that I use the exact same sounds from 20 years ago, like the little jangling kind of dulcimer sound at the beginning. Even though I now have, hundreds of better dulcimer recordings and different samples, and I have a few dulcimers of my own, it still has to be that original recording to have that sonic trigger. It's sort of like, the analogy I make is that you can't change the sound of Darth Vader's breathing. You can't say, oh, now technology is better, we can do a better version of it. It really needs to be the original recording of the scuba tank regulator or whatever it was from 1977, because it has, even casual viewers and listeners and, non-audio professionals, they can recognize if something has changed or is a different recording. And that sonic sort of imprinting of a particular piece of audio. I'm super glad that that theme has appeared in all these films and that I've been able to use some of those elements that are exactly as they were in the first film, but then use that as a launching point to go on some wild detour. And for this one, I knew that there was going to be a whole slab of it, which needed to be, the very beginning needed to start as expected. And then as we build towards the end, it was going to incorporate a lot of elements from Saw 6 and from some of the later sequels in the first chunk. But there is kind of immediately after John Kramer's kind of sits up from the torture device, and we've kind of established that, okay, now it's time for the audience to pay attention because there's a lot of information about to be occurring, and you have to pay attention because this will be on the test. Then that musical theme can take a little detour, and this was something that that Kevin, the director, explicitly wanted. Was we had a sort of a little 4 or 5 note motif that was used very early in the movie as the basis for the hopeful themes as John Kramer is beginning in theory, his journey to a cure. And Kevin, the director, said, is there any way we can integrate some of that little melody, this da 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 da, into the traditional Hello Zepp framework? And so right after it kind of establishes itself and John Kramer sits up, then there's a section where all of the strings that are kind of chomping away at this percussive pattern, instead of what we would usually go to at that spot in that theme, then all of the string parts play a riff that's based on that little hopeful theme from earlier in the movie. And it took a couple of stabs at it to get it to not sound like somebody had changed the channel on the TV in the middle of the piece of music. And it kind of, in the final mix, it kind of goes sailing right by, and it doesn't feel like a big interruption, but just gives us a little bit of a new twist to the sort of overtly desperate and minor kind of chord pattern that usually is that entire piece of music. There's a little island of about 16 bars or so where it has this hopeful aspect. And then, of course, it all, like many things in a Saw movie, it all goes horribly wrong. But it turns back to the sort of more traditional melodic and chordal elements from the earlier versions of that cue. But it was nice to be able to go on a brief detour before settling back into familiar territory. And, one thing that's always important about that piece of music and where it sits in the film is that, like I said, that's always in the film where there's an ending reveal montage. So there might be shots that are we're doing flashback shots to reveal more information about what happened earlier in the film. There's also a voiceover narrating the scenario. So there's a lot to kind of pay attention to. And that piece of music, and this is, all credit to James Wan, because this is what he said right from the get-go in the first movie, is that he wanted it to be big and bold and strong and memorable and hooky, like a good AC/DC guitar riff or whatever. But it also couldn't be some flowery, elaborate composition that might draw too much attention to itself and therefore cause somebody in the audience to miss some crucial visual point or narrative point. So that was very much a conscious effort to create something that was sturdy and bold, but could be understood very quickly. And then kind of parked in the back of your mind and let it run as your front brain is concentrating on this complex plot reveal situation. So all credit to James Wan for vocalizing what it needed to do and how it needed to do it. And I'll take a little less credit for actually having made it do that, but it's proved to be very versatile because it is kind of hooky. And so it can function as like a comforting backdrop for this year's new scenario.
Well, I love the tweak that you did make with the hopeful melody in there. It does. I did notice it, and it is a great little reprieve, like you say, from the theme as a whole. But in speaking of the track's versatility, for my final question, I couldn't help but laugh when I saw on Twitter recently someone had pointed out that the Hello Zepp theme was used in the trailer for Deja Vu with Denzel Washington in 2004, 2005. And I'm curious if you were aware of that or if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I had no idea it was used in the trailer for that movie. Was that the Denzel movie where he's paralyzed in bed? And
No, it's
no,
the time travel movie.
Okay, right.
With Jim Caviezel as the villain, and
Right.
it was, I think, Tony Scott directed that one.
I had no idea that it was used for that particular one. Huge Tony Scott fan, sad that he's gone. And, although his movies take a lot of flack sometimes for being this shaky cam pyrotechnic mayhem, I think his movies are great. And every one that I've watched, I mean, even the corny ones, I think they're great. And when later in his career, when he got into, Man on Fire and movies like that, they were just like, some people like, it's a train wreck of visuals just flying at you. And I'm like, yeah, exactly. And Domino, similar, just really, he's Tony Scott's filmmaking to me is like a guitar amp turned up all the way, which has its place. And I love it. I had no idea that they had used Hello Zepp in the trailer for one of his films. That sounds, I'm gratified and relieved because I would like to think it'd be a perfect match, and he has a great ear for picking memorable and kind of left of center music choices, like all the Nine Inch Nails stuff that he put in Man on Fire, with the sort of little bendy guitar riff, which was just a snippet of a song from our album, The Fragile, but he used it to such great effect. So I am, that makes me to hear that they used that theme in one of his trailers. It warms my heart.
Well, I'm glad I could make you aware of it then. When I watched it through, I actually was kind of like, I was torn because obviously I'm a Saw fan. So I was like, oh, this is just, but it's Saw. But then the other part of me was like, okay, but it is fitting pretty well. Right. So you'll have to go find it after this and see for yourself.
And Tony gets, in my book, Tony Scott has permission and license to do whatever he wants.
Fair enough. He does. I mean, he did have an incredible filmography, so absolutely. I cannot fault you there. But thank you so much, Charlie, for taking the time to chat today. I greatly appreciate it. I'm going to keep spreading the word as I already have for this movie.
Excellent.
And I think people who haven't seen it yet are going to love it.
Excellent. Me too. And I'm so glad that it's beginning to find a little bit of favor with traditional movie critics and finding maybe a little bit wider audience. And again, it's all down to the writing and to Tobin's performance, which is just really fantastic in this film.
Well, hopefully critics go back to the first three at the very least and decide to bump their scores up now, because those three are legitimately great movies and deserve the praise. So yeah, I'm glad for Saw X as well. And yeah, great talking with you. I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.